Hi, everyone. Oh, that works now. Thank you for coming out so early in the morning. And it's pretty cold, too. I'm sure you felt that bite when you were walking across the parking lot here at the experimental farm. Merci d'être venu aujourd'hui. My name is Jennifer Ditchburn. I'm the president and CEO of the Institute for Research on Public Policy. We're a 51-year-old think tank. We do in-depth research on a range of public policy issues. We convene events like this one. We publish studies like the one that you hopefully got a copy of today by Peter here. We're also the publisher of Policy Options magazine, and we're the home of the Centre of Excellence on the Canadian Federation, which does research on Canada's federal community. Et nous travaillons évidemment dans les deux langues officielles. Alors, si vous avez une question en français tout à l'heure, s'il vous plaît, posez-le, puis posez-la, je vais la traduire. This is a new location for us to hold an event at the experimental farm, but I think exceedingly relevant to the topic today. This site was always designed to be an area for research and advancement of agriculture. But if we think back to before this was a federal site, before it was owned by farmers, this was part of traditional Algonquin Anishinaabe territory. And the Anishinaabe people were excellent farmers themselves and had quite advanced research into agriculture. So we'd like to recognize, the Institute would like to recognize that this is unceded and unsurrendered Algonquin Anishinaabe territory. This is the first of a series of events and papers that we're working on in conjunction with TELUS, and hello, Joe. We are looking at imagining a better digital future for Canada. And I want to direct you to the paper that some of you had received when you came in the door, or that's on your table, by Peter Phillips, who is on today's panel, entitled, "Can Canada Help Feed the World While Reducing Emissions? Assessing Challenges and Barriers to Digital Opportunities in Agriculture." That's a heavy title, Peter. But I think that you drew a lot of interest with your work, and I'm excited to discuss it. So drawing from Peter's paper, let me share some facts about the sector. Primary agricultural operators generate almost $32 billion of GDP annually and employ 241,000 workers. I'm not including the millions of workers that are associated in some way for the food and beverage industry and others connected to agriculture. 6.3% of Canada's land area is cultivated for agriculture. We have a diverse, innovative, and experienced sector that could potentially be a world leader in digital technology and applications, but we have some barriers to overcome, which we're going to discuss. Let me just read from an excerpt from Peter's paper here. He says, "The scale of the economic opportunity in growing global markets, combined with the societal benefits of greater global food security and a more efficient, lower emission food production system, justifies an ambitious strategy." So let me introduce our panel. To my immediate left is Peter Phillips, Distinguished University Professor Emeritus at the Johnson Shoyama Graduate School of Public Policy, a great partner to the IRPP over the years, at the University of Saskatchewan. Katherine MacDonald is Director General Strategic Management at the Information Systems Branch at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. Lenore Newman is Director of the Food and Agricultural Institute at the University of Fraser Valley. So this is very early for Lenore today. And last but not least is Tyler McCann, Managing Director of the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute. And Tyler is also a beef and goat farmer in Western Quebec. And Tyler, I had a typo here where it said coat farmer. And I was trying to figure out, was that like a Canada Goose factory or something like that? But anyway, we're going to talk for about an hour, and I would like this to be, as informal as possible. So at the end of that, think about your questions. I am absolutely not an expert in this area, so I'm sure you'll have even better questions than I do to ask, and we have a microphone here in the room. So I just wanted to start with some basics. Katherine, can you give us some examples in lay terms of what we mean when we talk about digital technology in agriculture?
Yeah. You just reminded me of a time Tyler told me he was going to Shawville, and I thought he was going to shovel. So this happens to you a lot, I think, Tyler.
Yeah, shovel and shovel.
So yeah, it's a really good question because I think we use different terms, right? We use digital agriculture, agricultural technology, agricultural innovation, and they can kind of mean a range of things. Like, for example, we're in the Central Experimental Farm here in Ottawa, one of 20 Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada research centers, and you could describe a lot of the work that's done here as agricultural technology. Much of it is digital. The scientists here have a mandate to develop new crop varieties, genetics, new agronomic practices with the goal of enhancing the productivity and sustainability of Canadian agriculture. Actually, one interesting example of digitization that's happening here is the digitization of our specimen collections. So if you had never had a chance to visit the specimen collections at the research center here, there's like 19 million. It's a really interesting kind of crossroads of science and history, and worth trying to wrangle yourself a tour if you haven't before. But 19 million specimens of plants, insects, fungi, and sometimes the data consists of like a handwritten label. So for the past few years, we've really been working on digitizing those collections with images, DNA, other information, so that we can really benefit from that wealth of data, look for trends to make scientific discoveries, help inspection agencies identify pests and weeds more quickly, maybe find wild relatives of food crops that could be used in research on new varieties. So an interesting example of digitization that's happening here. But my focus tends to be more on the digital adoption by agricultural businesses. So a bit of a narrower definition. So we're talking about things like robots, automated vehicles, other automated systems, sensors, data collection, generation, analysis, sharing, automated decision-making, AI, that kind of thing. Precision agriculture in crops is a really good example. So we've had things like GPS auto steer for a long time now. If you're steering manually, you'd overcompensate to not miss areas, end up overlapping a few feet every pass. The auto steer can bring that down to a few inches. That saves time, labor, fuel. It reduces wear and tear. Basically, the computers are better at driving. Precision agriculture kind of takes that a step further, using sensors to look at plants and soil. As the machinery passes over, it takes that data along with historical data, weather data, scientific knowledge to come up with the best amount and type an application of, say, fertilizer, and apply it almost like a prescription to individual plants or parts of the field. And that can be done kind of automatically in real time using a lot of digital technologies. So with these technologies, we can really get real-time data on soil health, moisture levels, crop growth, and pests, and this can help optimize fertilizers, pesticides, irrigation, reduce waste, and be more productive and reduce their environmental impact. I'll just say there's a couple of really neat precision agriculture experiments for corn production being done at Area X.O here in Ottawa, which is our smart farm outside of town. And at a demo day recently, I saw they had like a tractor, a self-driving tractor going up and down one of the fields, which was pretty cool and hard to imagine that kind of won't be the way of the not too distant future. They also had a stalk of corn with 5 ears on it, which was pretty phenomenal, but partly as a result of some of the research that's happening on there. But there's lots going on the animal side as well, I would say. So like robotic milkers are pretty well established. Sensors for animals in greenhouses. Urban agriculture, vertical farming, so growing crops in digitally supported, controlled environments is a good example. And one last example I'll give is AAFC and Impact Canada are running a big food loss and waste challenge right now, and we're getting down to the finalists, and there's some really neat projects there. You can check them out online. Food waste is a huge issue with big environmental and financial impacts, and a couple of finalists have digital systems that are using sensors and computer vision to look at different parts of the kind of food supply chain to help businesses make better decisions about harvest, transportation, logistics, and that kind of thing. So lots of really cool stuff out there, and I'm sure you're going to hear more examples as we go through. Thanks.
Tyler, you're a farmer in Western Quebec, in addition to your other role. What kind of digital technology are you seeing as opposed to what you would see in Western Canada or in the Maritimes?
So I think it's important to keep in mind that agriculture, we talk a lot about east versus west in the country, but agriculture tends to be more about commodity value chain. So I have a lot more in common with a beef farmer in Western Canada than I do with a vegetable grower in Southern Ontario. But an example that we use, and we also get into this big difference, and Peter's paper touches on this a little bit around scale. So this is, for us, it's a kind of a very big hobby at home, but it is, so what we would use a very limited amount of, others are using a lot of. And the example that I'll use that we don't use as much as we could, but it gets to some of the issues around cost and barriers to adoption, is really leveraging the technology that comes with animal ID. So years ago, Canada, in response to in-part disease pressures, put in place a set of regulations that require animals to have an RFID tag in their ear. So an animal leaves, a beef cow, I was going to say animals, not every animal, but a cow leaves a farm in Canada, they need to have a tag in their ear. That, in theory, can pass by a scanner, and that can pick that animal up, and you get this unique animal ID that traces it all along the value chain. What we're seeing is that was in part driven by the need to identify our animals to enable a quick disease response. But that technology around unique animal identification really opens up a lot of opportunity on the management side. And so you get systems where your beef cow will be running through a chute where you're going to give it a needle, and that you can kind of have automatic readers that will pick up which animal you're going to give the needle to, that will record the drugs that you're giving that animal to, that information then can go into, again, a database that can be connected all along the value chain, that can give you precise animal health information. It can speak to the conditions that animal was raised in. In theory, that information can be passed along to the next link in the value chain, which for us, which would be a feedlot, that can then add to that information that can then go on to the slaughterhouse and then present a more complete set of information that's passed on to the consumer. That's the potential, right? There's a lot of barriers, and again, in our case, we've only got 60 cows, so it's easier for us to kind of manage that on our own. The value chain itself isn't quite there yet, or the opportunities, the value for that information to come back to me as a producer isn't quite what you would like it to be in order to really justify that. You get some economies of scale of larger producers that make it more worthwhile, but it presents an example of one of the building blocks of digital agriculture that really can unlock a lot of potential. Again, it's there. And the other thing I would say is that probably a lot of farmers don't understand how much of digital agriculture they're already doing today, right? One of the pieces that again is something that we need to look to and think about the future of is how do we connect all of the things that we're already doing, right? So how do we do a better job connecting our bookkeeping that's done up in the cloud with our animal health information that's done up in the cloud too? How do you find ways to put this all together? How do you connect that with the information around our fields and how our crops are growing? Putting all of those different pieces together is an interesting challenge and something that, again, will help unlock really that value for producers and the rest of the value chain.
Thank you. And Lenore, what's driven this interest in these technologies in the sector?
Well, I think there's a number of things emerging where what we really see is desire for the technology moving along a little bit ahead of some of the fear of the things it opens us up to. And in the data side, I really like to look at it as data as opportunity versus data as threat. And I'm seeing that play out in the controlled environment space particularly. So what's really driving in the controlled environment space, which I do a lot of work in, and related spaces. So think fancy greenhouse. Basically, a lot of the work I'm doing is with advanced greenhouse technology, where growers are really getting onto the idea that, wow, we have so much control now over, say, about 12 different variables, which is roughly what they might have in an advanced greenhouse or vertical farm, where you're controlling the lighting, the water, the CO2 level, all these, the darkness periods, the genomics. You've got really great control. And what we're starting to see is we're seeing good uptake on data as opportunity. Good uptake there. People are realizing they can chart all these, and the physicist in me loves this because it's an optimization problem, in that you literally can play with all these variables. They all have a cost, so you can raise your CO2, but it costs a bit. Does that give you enough growth? And you can tune your greenhouse like an instrument, so you're getting the best output possible. And there's really great uptake on that. Data as threat, though, is harder in that what we're finding is the same people who are adopting the technology are lagging a bit on understanding it makes them vulnerable. And so, and I love the idea, by the way, in the paper of a data market, of pooling data, of trading data. And it's great as long as you remember that that same data can be your undoing. And coming from a university, it's a constant challenge, keeping our data safe. We think a lot about data as threats. So our university, we've got about 8,000 people on campus, constantly downloading things, clicking on links that say click here, doing weird sketchy email stuff and breaking the network constantly. And so what, I did a little backstory into our own security, and we have an entire department fighting malware, fighting Trojans, fighting denial of service, coming from everywhere, from some guy in a room who has beef with us to foreign governments attacking our systems, trying to get our data. And convincing farmers that this is a threat they tend to realize that after it's happened. But a controlled environment, like a greenhouse, a massive greenhouse, say you've got 60 acres under glass, millions and millions of dollars of product growing, you're really vulnerable if your network is vulnerable because you've got employees on your network, you might have, you've got the exact same threats. And so it is this weird trade-off, and I almost feel we're doing really well in Canada on the uptake, but we do need to help the sector realize, hey, we're vulnerable, and everyone from a disgruntled employee to a foreign government may want to hack your greenhouse and turn off your water flow in the middle of the night, or hack your chicken barn and turn the temperature way up. And if your password is password, which, bad example that I encountered recently, and we put really a lot into good biosecurity in this country, and we lead in biosecurity. And they don't let me walk into a 60-acre greenhouse in my street clothes. I'm wearing like a hazmat suit. They shouldn't let me log onto their network ever, no matter how badly I need to check my email. And I think there is this awareness. So I think in a weird way, we're doing well on adoption, but we have to remember there's two sides to this coin.
And the only thing I'd add, and in the paper I say there's sort of, I call them 3 utopian visions of agriculture. There's a lot focused on farm. There's we talked here in this panel, there's been some examples of the upstream, how research will change what farmers can do and should do and might do. We always forget that there's another part to the world, and that is the downstream satisfaction of the consumers. That's huge. We spend a lot of time worrying about Bayer and its market control. The top 7 food companies, retail food companies in the world, are massive. They make our companies look tiny. The top branded food producers are massive. They similarly have heavily invested in this, and they're pulling into the chain. So there's pressures from the upstream research world, there's pressures from the consumer side, and the consumers is where the value is realized. And so they have, they've always had access to our consumption patterns. It's getting more sophisticated, and as that tightens up and starts to move into the chain, you'll start to see parts of these commodity chains actually be as integrated as what was described in the food system, or in the beef system, where you've got this life cycle control over the product. And that's where the big returns will be, both socially and economically, but that's where the distribution of the returns will get a bit hairy, and we may not like the outcomes if we don't engage with the choices.
But I think that the question around value is a really important part of the equation, right? And I think where you see the adoption, where we've seen the adoption today, is where there are these really clear examples of what that value proposition is. Lenore provided a really good example about the greenhouse, right? Those variables, the producers there are doing the math. They understand what the value proposition is for them. A farmer that is using precision agriculture, that's using variable rate technology, can do the math, right? How much am I going to save on my fertilizer bill if I invest in this new seed drill, right? The seed drill is going to cost more money, but they can do the math, figure out what does this precision agriculture enable them to do? What's the value of that digital agriculture piece? I think that that's really, that takes care of itself. It's what about everything else where you can try and drive more value along the value chain? Again, go back to that beef example where if what I'm doing is trying to market a more sustainable beef and I need to provide that assurance system, I need to be able to put all of that information together, digital agriculture really should be key, will be key to enabling that. If I'm a producer trying to access carbon credits, the digital infrastructure behind that is enormous. And it is those pieces where the value proposition today maybe is not as clear as we would like it to be, where I think that we really struggle. And if the value proposition is there, adoption will take care of itself, right? Farmers like to, maybe like is a strong word, farmers buy $1 million combines because there's a value proposition behind it. Farmers will invest in the technology if the value proposition is there. Some parts of digital agriculture, it's just a little trickier to see what that really looks like today.
So let me just take a step back and talk about where the opportunities, there's challenges and opportunities which you start to touch on. So the previous Minister of Finance's Council on Economic Growth, seems like a long time ago now, but it did happen, was very bullish on agriculture and called this Canada's agri-food moment. The World Bank has said agriculture accounts for 4% of gross global domestic product. The Boston Consulting Group Centre for Canada's Future and the Agri-Food Institute at the University of Guelph say Canada's new moonshot, everyone likes to say moonshot, should be to produce 26% more food by 2050 and become a global agri-food powerhouse. But at the same time, agriculture accounts for a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. About 1/3 of the world's man-made man-made greenhouse gas emissions. Canadian farmers contribute about 10% of Canada's GHGs. And in the meantime, it's affecting crop yields, creating food insecurity. 783 million people faced hunger in 2022. That's higher than even before the pandemic. So we have these sort of competing things that are happening on the landscape. Peter, I'm going to ask you sort of a big question. Why should politicians, senior public servants, care about digital agriculture and want to invest in it and address some of the barriers that we're going to talk about in a moment?
I mean, the basic question in all these things is why this, why now? Mm-hmm. Perhaps it's my gray hair. I'll just give you a bit of a reference point. When I started in the public policy world, I got dragged into agriculture. It wasn't my particular area of interest. And agriculture was a basket case. We talked about it as a sunset industry. It was perpetually coming to Ottawa, the Western Canadian portion, saying we need more. The crops were failing, that we had the global trade wars. The industry was flat to declining rapidly. Fast forward to the end of my professional career, and what you find is a completely different set of orientation. It's not that all the problems have gone away, they're a different set of problems. The industry is in the growth phase. It's actually growing. Most people don't realize that. And it's hitting all the policy objectives of this and most governments around the world. We're as a group, but differentially in Western Canada, we're producing food that feeds a lot more people than live in Canada. Most of what we produce, we export. And it's at the bottom of the food pyramid. It's the grains and the oil seeds and the pulses that both feed animals, but primarily feed poor people. And so it's critical to that underpinning of food security globally, but it's also high tech. And that's where I think the debate has never quite permeated the policy space. There's a perception that farming is a 19th century industry. It's a 21st century industry. If you use 3 M's model, which used to be the iconic actor. They said their goal was 25% of gross receipts every year from a product that wasn't in their product line 3 years ago. Farming, most of farming, is ahead of that. It's 30 to 35%. The seed stock turns over in many of our more industrialized parts of the system in 2 to 3 years. Farmers aren't planting the same seeds for 20 or 30 years, maybe in wheat, but in most other crops, they're planting something that the buyers and the Syngentas of the world have produced and are bringing into the market. So the new technology is rapidly advancing. And what makes it particularly interesting from a Canadian perspective is that you may have heard that we've got a productivity gap. Not a problem in agriculture. Our productivity is growing quite nicely. You may have heard we've got a gap in moving technology from idea to use. Not in agriculture. Agriculture has a pathway to moving technology into the market. It's not perfect. No pathways are perfect, but it happens. You compare that to most of the other areas where we get to startup stage and then the technology vanishes into the global space. This is hitting all the metrics that our policy community wants, that our elected official wants, and I think that the citizens want. So it's, and when I get a little bit more thinking about the future, I think we have a moral obligation. This is one of the few places that has stable, secure, and exportable surpluses. There's only 5 countries in the world that produce the bulk of the exportable surpluses that sustain our global food system. We're one of the 5. And we actually proportionally put more in than most others. So we have an obligation. We're worried about what's our role in the world. Food is a big part of it. At times we've talked about energy being an energy superstar. Yeah, in very small ways. In food, we're big. And so I think that's the part that we often forget, is that we have not only the assets and the capacity, but we have the global reputation to actually take advantage and do good for the world, but do good for ourselves too, because this is a profitable industry now. It wasn't always in my career, but now it is. Not every day, not every product, not every year, but over the path of a farmer's life, this is highly profitable, and all the people feeding in and out do very well in terms of the inputs and the output side. So I think it hits all the milestones we should be wanting. We just forget that. And I guess the final point, because it's about the environment, yeah, it has been contributing 10%. Half of that's animal waste, pretty much animal waste. The other half is crops, and in certain crops, we're net zero. So that's what we're looking for. We're there in many of our dryland crops now. So we need to make that we need to move that technology into other parts of our system, but move that technology globally. And we have some potential to do that as well.
Lenore, you nodding, and let me ask the rest of the panel on you. Peter talked about food security. What about sustainability and the development of digital technology in agriculture? How could that help us meet our goals, our emissions goals? Either one of you, go ahead.
Maybe I can go first, because I want to first agree with Peter on something. Food really should be a greater part of Canada's geopolitical agenda. Like, we really do miss a lot as a country by not understanding the really vital role that food can play in our foreign policy agenda. If you look at the assets, I mean, we really have been seized as a country with critical minerals. I think we're quite excited about the role that we can play and the potential. But that potential is the reality in agriculture and food today. And so I often say that it would be nice for the Global Affairs Canada to think of agriculture and food not just as a trade irritant that needs to be resolved from time to time, but as a geopolitical asset. But I'm going to disagree with Peter. We do have a productivity problem in Canada, especially if you're trying to connect that production, food security, and sustainability agenda. It's interesting, because I'm going to contradict myself a bit and say that moonshot that they set to 26% increase in food production, that's not very ambitious. If you look at what we've done on canola in the last 20 years, we produce 200% more canola today than we did 20 years ago. We produce almost 200% more soybeans than we did 20 years ago. We produce 50% more wheat than we did 20 years ago. Unfortunately, when it comes to beef and pork, we don't produce that much more than we did. We produce effectively the same, but that has a lot more to do about market pressures than it does our ability to grow and increase production. But if you look at the rate of total factor productivity in Canada, it is going in the wrong direction. It needs to be increasing, and what we're doing is that growth rate is slowing down. If you look at what the OECD says globally, if we want to meet food security and sustainability goals, we need to boost productivity, agriculture productivity by about 28% over the next decade. That is 3 times the rate of increase over the last decade. We do have a productivity problem. I guess maybe we don't have a gap because agriculture in all of the developed world is struggling with productivity, but we have a fundamental issue in Canada and other major food producers that we are not doing enough to get more out of the food, out of the agriculture production system that we have. We don't invest enough in R&D anymore. We don't have the enabling mechanisms to encourage that. Again, we do okay, but we need to do a lot better if we want a food system that is more productive, that is more sustainable. And digital agriculture really is one of those enabling technologies that is going to form, that can form part of the core of doing more, producing more with less.
Yeah, I would add by violently agreeing with Peter as well that one of the things I find most frustrating is that attitude that somehow this is a 19th century industry. It is an extremely technology-heavy industry with huge capital expenditures, and I often feel that philosophy of what I sometimes call the Red Barn effect is so strangely North American and Canadian, and when I go to, say, the Netherlands, that isn't there. And this idea of ag as a sunset industry is so strange, because I think it really only worked during that kind of Pax Americana period, where we're all like, oh, this is great. We can let someone else produce the food really cheaply. They'll send it to us, and we can focus on something else. And as my dad used to say, how's that working out for you now? Well, the answer is poorly, and I think you see that around the world. And we're in an era now where a country like Singapore with no farmland is saying, well, we're going to produce 30% of our food domestically somehow because we need to for national security. Well, Canada, we can do it. We can just produce our food and export to the world. And so I think bringing it back to the sustainability, at the end of the day, the food industry is the world's most important industry, because if you turn all the industries off, it's the one you miss first, in my opinion. And we're well set to be that stable source. And to me, the technology, and exactly like you say with canola, it's about producing more with less input, which really is what we need to learn to get a handle on the carbon question. So it is interesting, though, because there's a philosophical issue that at least, even if the public still might think that farming is somehow very old school, the government needs to not think that for this to work for us.
Does the government think that farming is old school? I don't think Catherine does it.
No, I think, we really recognize that link between technology and sustainability and productivity, and some of the reason we have those programs like the Ag Clean Tech program and the On-Farm Climate Action Fund is to, basically, I think, pay and share a bit of the risk with producers on adopting some of these technologies that can really make a difference.
So let's talk about adoption and bite into some of the obstacles that the industry is facing, the sector. Individual farmers, why is there not the uptake in some of these digital technologies, or better uptake?
Again, I think that we reject the premise of the question,
Okay.
right? Because there is uptake, right? Where there isn't a good value proposition, there isn't uptake. But that's because there isn't a good value proposition. And so I think that there could be more fundamental issues and challenges that exist. I actually...
Value proposition, I guess, is a better question.
Yeah, and so that again depends on the context, right? I don't think you need to improve the value proposition in that controlled greenhouse where they can see that technology and do the math. If you're talking in the sustainability context, it's about putting more value into the system, right? So how do you design a carbon market system that enables that money to get back to the farmer? Digital infrastructure is going to be a big part of what that system looks like, and so that will need to be implemented and developed in order to put that value back into the system. But one of the problems I think that we run into a little bit with public policy today in agriculture is that adoption really seems to be the focus. And I think that we're dealing a bit of kind of short-term gain for potentially long-term pain. And if you look at how Agriculture Canada is spending its money today, it really is prioritizing adoption. And that's doing that at the risk or by not prioritizing research and development in and of itself, right? And I think we see the potential for reducing a ton of carbon today by pushing different practices without recognizing that it's not necessarily, I mean, the ton of carbon today is really important, but it's what about the 50 or 100 tons 10 years from now by developing better, more strategic practices, by delivering the technology, developing the technology that can deliver more of the systems change that we need. And so I think people get caught up in adoption. It is not just adoption, it is research and development. And if you're developing the right technologies that make sense to farmers, they will adopt them. Like I think that we need to shift how we think about that.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think it's interesting. The adoption issue comes up a lot, but it depends how you count it. If you count adoption per acre, we're actually great. We do fine. If you count it per farmer, is where you run into the problem, because the smaller farms have more trouble adopting technologies that have a big high upfront cost, and rightly so. And I think the only way you can deepen that penetration is to look toward missing middle kind of technologies, where the CapEx is lower for those smaller farmers. Now, the one exception that I do think does need to be a real national priority, when I was doing work for the BC government and we were touring the province looking at adoption, it became really clear that fast internet is, and lack of, is a barrier. And once we got into the northwest, northeast of the province, no one's cell phone worked. And I'm like, well, what do you know? And when we talk to the farmers, they're like, yeah, I'm on dial-up. Or I've got satellite, but it's too expensive. I can't use it for this. And so actually wiring the country for fast internet is probably the one low-hanging fruit we could do that would allow smaller producers or more remote producers who might be large to use these technologies effectively.
But sorry, Lenore touches on one of these, I think, inconvenient truths that we don't like to talk about in agriculture, right? A lot of those small farms that face the barriers to adoption are relatively insignificant when it comes to food production, to food security, to sustainability, right? It is the 10% of farms that produce 50% of food that are, or more, that really are the game changers. That is where that needs to be focused. And we run into this inconvenient reality where when you try and design public policy for all farmers, it creates an issue, because what you're trying to do is probably force technology adoption on a set of farmers that really don't matter or don't have the same impact on the grand scheme of things. And I would just add on broadband, it is broadband, but it is also that next step around what about satellites, what about that connectivity in this new system. TELUS is pioneering technology, right, where you're going to be able to connect your tractor to a satellite, and so you're not going to have to take your information back to the farm and plug it into your computer. It'll go right up into the satellite directly. Again, it is that broader piece where government can play a really important enabling role, and creating that, bringing those players that are not, again, I don't think we typically think of TELUS as an agriculture company, even though increasingly it is so, but bringing those other providers into the sector to help them understand and help agriculture work with them together more efficiently.
Can we touch on cybersecurity because there was a mention of it earlier, Catherine. What are the issues around data security and that is being held in the sector, and why might farmers be worried about the impact of technology on data security?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things at play here. I think you have kind of digital security in agriculture more generally, so how, and then you have kind of how data is being collected and used with this move to digital agriculture. So kind of related but slightly separate issues. And farmers do generate a lot of data, production, environment, performance data, financial data. They have employee data, customer data, probably lots of other types of data as well. I spent a lot of my time working on cybersecurity issues. We have a bit of a campaign going this year to try and enhance the cybersecurity of primary agriculture in particular, but also kind of agriculture and food more generally in Canada. But farmers, I think like most of us, need to kind of up their game in cybersecurity. We see that they are being hacked, they're being hit with ransomware. The data and the stories we hear suggest they're often paying the ransom. So we need to be doing, they need to be doing things like, using longer passwords, not using password as their passwords. Being really careful, like staying off public networks, separating their home and work networks. Like I keep telling them, don't trust your kids and don't trust your parents. Definitely don't trust your parents. Using multi-factor authentication, all the same stuff that we should be doing. Enabling antivirus software, doing their computer upgrades, having backup systems so they can recover without paying the ransom, like all that kind of stuff. Having plans in place when you do get hacked, because it could happen, and knowing what you're going to do if that happens. Cyber criminals can be after the data. They can also just kind of be after disruption in order to make a quick buck. So really interested in this issue. I was really glad you were talking about it, Lenore, so maybe we can have a bit of a conversation about it. And that's not even getting into the issue of like supply chain cybersecurity, which probably needs a whole other panel. But the other issue is around data privacy and security, and like farmers can be really sensitive about their data. They don't like government having too much of their financial and performance data, or not knowing exactly what we're doing with it, so we're kind of used to that at Agri-Food Canada. But now they're generating all this data with the digital equipment that they're using, which is provided by companies who are collecting that data automatically and using it to build out further systems, which in theory benefits their users. Like it's meant to be a good cycle, but there's questions about who owns that data, who can use it, who can benefit from it. I think people have different perspectives here, from like whatever, take my data, to like don't get anything, and people probably fall somewhere in between. But a lot of the issue is it's just hard to know even when you click that I've read the terms and agree button, if you've actually even read the terms. It's a real issue. There's an organization in the US called Ag Data Transparent, which is worth checking out if you want to learn about some of the work underway to address this. They really believe that companies need to be clearer with their customers about how their data is being used, use contracts that have really easy to understand language so people know what they're signing on to. They believe that farmers own the data that they generate and should be notified about how things are changing and how it's being collected. And sometimes farmers need to agree in order for the product to actually be useful, but just I think being transparent about that is really important. And so basically companies can sign up to be certified by Ag Data Transparent, giving producers some peace of mind that hopefully they'll have a more positive relationship with those companies around their data. And you see some familiar names signing up, like John Deere and CropMetrics and Syngenta. And I think Farm Credit Canada here at home might have been the first Canadian company to sign up to that, if I'm not mistaken. So definitely a big issue, multifaceted issue, but lots going on there.
Peter, you talk in your paper about data governance, and which dovetails with what Catherine was talking about. Can you tell us a bit about what you think that Canada needs? Also in your paper, I highlighted this because I thought it was interesting. 95% of data generated is in an unstructured raw format, and few, if any, firms or consumers are deriving much sustained net value from the application of data in the production and marketing system. So on one hand, there's a question about data security, privacy. Yep. On the other hand, there is, are we actually doing anything with the data that we have? Well, we are, but doing enough. Yep. Can you talk about the governance issue?
There's a variety of data governance questions. Everybody wants it to work for them, and there's a perception that data has value in and of itself. It doesn't. Nobody owns it. You can control it, but you don't own it. It's everything around the data you own. The algorithms, the analysis, the interpretations, the interfaces. So as an individual producer or an individual operator in the supply chain, you can have a lot of data, but all it does is it's like an audit trail. It's not helping you to manage and control your operations. The value that everybody's talking about is the network part of it. One person's data is interesting, and maybe it has diminishing returns for the individual producer, but it has returns. The positive returns, and some argue increasing returns over a long period of time, is when you pool your data with others. You get more sophisticated capacities to make these precision choices in your operations. They're not based on your operation alone. They're based on 1,000 or 10,000 or millions of operations doing the same technique, refining to get that optimization there. That part, whether we like it or not, there's a network effect. Your data is worth more when it's pooled, and then there's lock-in. They go together. Doesn't matter what industry we're talking about. Once people have agglomerated enough data, you get locked into it, because the value that's being generated is internal to that system, whatever it is. And sure, under certain rules, you may be able to extract your data and move across to the next one, but apropos of the comment about the lack of formatting, even when it's formatted, it's seldom interoperable. So one person will use one system, one will use the other. Remember, when we started using computers, those of us who have a bit more gray hair, there were two dominant systems. There was the Apple world and the Microsoft world. And they both operated on the basis that their job wasn't done until you could not move things across that boundary. So you had to manually take them out and retype them or scan them to be able to use them into the next system. And you lost all the formatting and all the value of the advanced system. We have that today. And some of it's just legacy. I mean, remember, this is an industry that has been investing in science and management for the better part of 200 or 300 years. Progressive, sort of proactive science and management. And a lot of that's in coil notebooks, apropos of the gene banks. A lot of it's in legacy systems that are using archaic codings that are not transferable to the current system. But even this new stuff is locked into proprietary systems. And so there's a real risk that if you're not part of the defining of that world, you can come late to the party, and yes, you'll get some value, but whatever the algorithms are telling you about how you should operate, they're based on operating systems that aren't like yours, or aren't as closely like yours. We have an operating system that differs from Australia, differs from the US Midwest, differs from Australia, from Northern Europe, it differs from China, differs from India. Those are our major producing competitors. And so if that's where they're training their tools and building their management advice, it can be used here, but it has less value. So the risk of being autonomous and controlling everything is that you simply become a backwater. And that's, I don't know how we get around that. You know, the global supply chains we're part of, we have a piece of the supply chain. We don't control it from the beginning to the end. And so it doesn't matter whether it's canola, which is our crop. You know, we invented the canola. It's our name. You know, we are still ground zero for virtually every innovation in that sector. We still rely heavily on the multinational companies for the intellectual property and most of the seed management. We rely heavily on the processing sector, which is differentially outside of Canada. So if you're going to control that supply chain, if you're not contributing to it, to the training of these operations, whether it's AI or simply algorithmic based, you're going to lose the ability to extract the maximum value. And so that's the risk, is that we can be autonomous, but we lose the higher returns. We can join them. There's a possibility we lose some autonomy, but we may actually get them investing in our space rather than in Argentina, Brazil, you know, countries that are a bit more responsive and adapt faster. It's not that we don't adapt these technologies. If you're the second and third adopter, your returns drop dramatically. You're catching up. You're not setting the pace anymore. And that's, up until now, we've been setting the pace in a lot of these crop categories and some of the animal categories. We have the possibility that we could slip, and the systems that are designed won't be designed for us. And we all experience that in our personal lives. You know, we look at it and say, who invented this? It doesn't work for me. Farmers have the same problems, and we can customize them and fine-tune them, but there's a higher cost of coming in and trying to change an existing system. So we have, this is early days. We can define the future, or we can let others define the future and then try and fit into that.
Well, in about 10 minutes, I'll start taking some of your questions, but this leads nicely into a conversation about solutions.
Yeah.
And in your paper, I mean, in the heart of your paper, you're talking about the risk of Canada being marginalized and not, having a seat at the table. And we are not currently a global leader in digital agriculture. So what would you suggest? How can we become that leader, or at least play in the big leagues, so that we don't become a sort of digital technology backwater? I'm using hyperbolic language there, but
in about 30 seconds, I'll give you the three options we have. One is we muddle through. We just buy off the shelf. We don't do anything customized. We just wait for other people to develop, and we'll adapt it and use what it's useful. Second one is we can do what is a popular policy in Ottawa today, is find national champions. Unfortunately, our national champions are really small, really undercapitalized, and often what one of my science colleagues called one-trick ponies. You know, they only have one technology. You need 20 to 50 to be viable in this space. If you're only selling one, you're going to die or survive based on that single technology, and that's not a basis for an industry. So the third option is, how do we work in a world of large data aggregators that are primarily located outside of Canada, and large data aggregate upstream and downstream of us. And so we've done that in the past. I'd say a lot of our small grains and oilseeds have been very successful in fitting into that world and occupying a really profitable, productive niche that's good for us and good for the world. I think we can do the same thing here, but only if we have some ambition. And it goes back to the question of, is it just adoption? No. It's, when I say we're doing okay in agriculture, we're hitting all the bars that are there now, and we're as good as anybody in the world, but that's not very good. In the digital world and in the bioscience world, they're investing in excess of 10% of the gross value added in new research and commercialization opportunities. Agriculture invests about 0.5% of its gross value added. That's as good as it gets in the world, but that's not very good for an industry that's important. We'll probably never get to 10%, but if we can double it. I sat in a conversation last week with the seed growers of Canada, and farmers there were saying, I'm not going to adopt the next technology. I'll wait for somebody to show me that next seed is good. And we did back-of-envelope calculations, and if farmers just moved up 1 year adoption, and some of them are 7 to 10 years behind the current leading variety, 1 year forward, that would add no extra cost, not a cent more on their operating side. It would add 10% to their gross profit. And they said, no thanks. And in many cases, the lag is 7 to 8%, 7 or 8 years. So you move up 7 or 8 years, all of a sudden you've doubled your gross profit margin for no extra cost. It's just this hesitancy to be upfront. So some parts are right at the cutting edge. If you're using hybrid seed, you've got to be buying every year. But if you can bin run, the average age of the seed stock is pathetically bad, and that permeates into how much they're willing to invest. They're quibbling over spending $1 a ton as a levy for research as farmers. That's like $1 on $400. We're talking about 1/4 of 1%. Trivial. And if they can get their money back, some of them will take the check back because, hey, it's $5,000, $10,000. But they're multi-million-dollar industries. $5,000 or $10,000 on research is not a lot. So there's a farm level challenge. There's a policy challenge. I think we have the potential, but we've got to move away from benign neglect and sort of doing it ourselves to thinking about how we engage with the world.
Catherine, we talk a lot about de-risking in this area. Can you explain what that might look like and some strategies to help Canadian farmers with the take-up that we need? And by the way, recognizing that provincial governments are also heavily involved in this, not just the federal government, but we're putting you on the spot a little bit.
No, that's good. I mean, I think climate change is the big risk that we're talking about, but there's market volatility risk, there's labor challenges, there's weather risk related to climate change, but generally as well, pests, disease. So different organizations can take action to make the decision of producers and processors to adopt new ways of doing things easier, so to remove some of the risk. Though fundamentally it's about sharing that risk. And ultimately, once these technologies are implemented, they should reduce risk and uncertainty. Like, that's kind of the whole idea. There's certain areas, I think, where government has an advantage in terms of action, but we don't have a monopoly on deciding what the future looks like. We need everyone involved for transformational change, and we're seeing a lot of leadership coming from different areas now, which is great. One of the things we can do is pull people together, work on strategies, consult broad groups of people, and that's definitely something that we make use of. We're doing that on robotics, on cybersecurity, traceability and digital credentials, data standards. We have two big strategies that we're working on in the department now, the labor strategy and the sustainable agriculture strategy, and I don't have any kind of inside intel on what to expect there, but I do think digital technology is likely to come up in the context of both of those. But the more we can talk to experts and really understand both the operational realities and the potential of these technologies, the better course of action we'll have. We can do science, especially when it's kind of far from commercialization. 50% of our workforce at AAFC works in science, and one of their missions, as outlined in the strategic plan for science, is to accelerate the digital transformation of the agriculture and agri-food sector. We can marshal resources, tax dollars to incentivize behaviors to have broader benefits. So I mentioned programs like Ag Clean Tech and Agri-Innovation, and there's other departments as well, some with deeper pockets than us, have programs that are supporting the sector as well through the Strategic Innovation Fund, for example, at ICET, or the Global Innovation Clusters. We can do things like run challenges. So I mentioned the food waste reduction challenges. That's just being finalized now. We have a new one that just launched as well around emission reductions of methane from cattle. And it's kind of like a bit of a prize system, right? Whereas innovators advance through the challenge, they get access to more funding. So it's a good way to generate innovation. Another thing we can do, and whether it's government or academia or nonprofits or even the private sector, is demonstration farms. And we tend to call these smart farms now exactly because of the digital angle. I mentioned Area X.O here in Ottawa, but there's smart farms across the country, and the idea is you can test an innovation in a real world setting and kind of prove that they work, and that obviously helps with adoption. So a company has an innovation, they can test it out on farm. Does it work in real life? Farmers can see it work or not. In some ways, our Living Lab program at AAFC is a bit like that. They started in 2018. I think there's 10 or so across the country now, complement the work of our research centers, but basically individually they bring together farmers, scientists, and others in the agriculture sector to test innovative technologies and on-farm practices to reduce emissions and sequester carbon in real-world conditions. And the goal here was to put farmers at the center of the research, kind of rather than at the end of it, knowing that their experiences and knowledge sharing will help accelerate the development and adoption of technologies. So that can help tackle climate change. We're doing some work around data standards. I think Peter covered that quite well. But most importantly, I think we need to listen. We need work like what's been done with this paper, and we need to work together and find partnerships to address some of the barriers and some of the big challenges that we need to solve.
Lenore, I think government is one part, but there's other players, business, academia, that could be working to help do some of the de-risking. Maybe I'll let you comment on what you've heard.
Yeah, it's, to me, so much of it is not about which of those pieces you have to pour resources into. It's about connecting them together. And, you know, I often go on and on about the Netherlands and how they managed to do this miraculous agri-tech miracle in that they're routinely ranked as either the first or second agri-tech power on Earth, and we're about 8th, just somewhere between 6 and 8 to keep in mind. And remember, the Dutch don't have any land to speak of. It's cold, and what land they have is, you know, they have to build. So you're kind of like, wow, how are they doing this? And I do feel policy is the main answer to that. They have a technique they call the triple helix, in which academy, industry, and government work tightly together to achieve a goal, which is sector dominance. And they actually call them top sectors. The government there targets 8 sectors. 2 of them are agricultural. One of them is horticulture, which is the one I'm most familiar with. And so to me, when I look at Canada, and of course, some of you know I've been doing work with Dr. Evan Fraser at the REL Institute to ask this exact question, is what does Canada need to be top 3 in ag tech is the call we're really putting out. And it's mostly about knitting together what we have, because sometimes it's very disjointed. So totally agree, we need to fund R&D better because our R&D funding has been dropping. And lockstep with that, our patents in the area are dropping. So, I mean, there's a clear correlation there. But we also can use the funding we do have, because we do a lot of funding, but we can do it smarter. And that's becoming really clear. It was charitably described to me about a week ago as a quilt. Canada has an agricultural quilt of funding, but the problem is what that really means is it's there, but you can't find it. It's all taken apart, and no one knows where it all is. We all just have little corners of the quilt. And so most of my funding, surprisingly, comes from the genome centers these days. It's a little square on the quilt. Someone else, they're pulling from NSERC, you know, and so part of it is smarter. So that's the funding piece. But then the one thing I do disagree slightly with Peter when he says we're really good at creating startups. Well, kind of. And my work in the incubator accelerator space with creative destruction, Rockies, etc. Yes, very strong in certain parts of the pipeline, but there's some holes. And I think that we all have to work together for those too. So R&D, we do put quite a bit into it. Our universities are great at creating invention, but that is not innovation. And then there's this little hole. And then here's the incubator accelerator system, which is also very strong. But there's a space that we discussed in what's called technological readiness levels. The space between 0 and 3 on the 9-point scale or whatever it is, there's a hole there that needs to be addressed. And the weird part then, they go along, we make these companies, we're really good, there's lots of VC support if you know where it is, lots of government support, there's MyTech, there's all these programs. Then we create these companies. Then there's another hole that we also have to all address, which is we create lots of great companies that then face a terrible choice. And they're like, well, I built a company, but to take it to the next level, I either stay here and I kind of stagnate, or I move south. And we lose a ton of them down south. And the question is, how do we take our successful mid-sized companies and connect them to the global market, which is what they need, because there aren't enough Canadians to get them the rest of the way through the ecosystem where they would come to like a sale point where then the founders would go on and found more companies. Instead, they have to move. So how do we connect them to global markets so they can fully fledge and move on, and that money can return into our ecosystem in venture capital? So to me, it's not so much which sector, it's about government, academy, and industry working tightly together to achieve a goal. And I think that's our challenge.
As a think tank president, I like the sound of that. Tyler, I'm going to give you the last word before questions. Maybe you could comment on what Lenore said. How do we help those companies scale up and compete globally?
So I'm going to pick on a different part of her comment. She said we need to work together to advance our goal, to achieve our goal. I'm not sure what our goal is, right? I think if you look at that triple helix of academia, government, and industry, we are not having the conversations that we need to have, right? I don't want to pick on Catherine and her colleagues from Agriculture Canada that are here, but I'm maybe going to pick on them a little bit, where I think we run into this temptation where everything is a priority all of the time, right? And we're working through two strategies there. She talked about labor, talked about the sustainable agriculture strategy. My worry is we're going to come out of those strategies that are largely going to say we're going to keep doing what we're doing because we're doing a pretty good job of it, and really we've covered all of our bases. Rather than saying, actually, here's where we're going to plant our flag. It could be digital agriculture, it could be ag tech. I don't think it's going to be, because I think we're going to say, oh, here we're going to kind of put flags all over the place, and we're not actually going to have that thoughtful focus. And the unfortunate reality is that we seem to have a harder time in the public-private policy space of doing things than we used to, right? It seems like you get into this bigger question about state capacity. How do we actually kind of move things forward? But I think that is driven in part by we don't do a good job setting really clear, specific goals and targets. Some of the things that have been touched on today, again, we don't necessarily do a great job of appreciating. Talked about the climate risk. Again, that doesn't necessarily acknowledge that today. So if you looked at ag publications in August, they would have told you that this year we were at significant risk of drought. Drought was going to wipe out yields in Canada and the United States. When you look at ag publications now, they'll talk about we're having almost a record harvest because we have done a really good job building more resilient crop varieties. That digital infrastructure that farmers are using is enabling them to make smarter decisions. Like we are doing a pretty good job in that space already. We've made a lot of progress. We can go further, but we can go further faster if we say this is actually what our goal and our objective is. And again, I think the Dutch do a much better job of it. I think we're seeing more out of it that in the United States. And I think unfortunately in Canada, it gets to be really fuzzy because sustainable agriculture can be a priority. But I'm sure if you asked everybody in the room, you're going to get many, many different answers as to what sustainable agriculture is. I think you're going to get many different answers about who should do what. I think we would be a lot further ahead if we could say, actually, here's where we're planting our flag. Here's what that goal is that we're all going to work towards.
Thank you. So we have a microphone here, and I'd invite you if you have a question for our very smart panel.
Good morning. I'm Jessica Norp, and I'm with AFC. It's my team that's actually leading the Sustainable Agriculture Strategy. So, and we are lucky to have Tyler as part of our advisory committee as well. And I'll also say that this was a question I was going to ask even before you said your comment, Tyler. So I kind of wish you didn't, because then I could have come across as a real superstar. But I guess, so a couple of things. Through the whole process, I think we've heard about data and digitization and clean tech as being such an important part from all stakeholders. And I think also a comment that Tyler had made about the value proposition is really important. So how do we ensure that, we have reliable estimates that producers can count on to know that they're kind of getting credit for the reductions they make, but also creating those markets that's going to give that value. And so, one thing we're trying to figure out is, and the strategy we're seeing is a bit of a call to action for all parts of the sector, and trying to figure out, okay, where is it best for the federal government to play in the space, right? Because there's a danger of, I think what Tyler's getting at, trying to be everything to everyone. And we're not going to be able to do that. So where is it? And I think the federal government has spent quite a bit of time putting out these incentives and that kind of thing. But I think what we're starting to realize is maybe our role is more in that enabling environment and making sure that we kind of set that up to help bring in the private sector that might be able to, if they're trying to reduce their scope 3 emissions, having some of those kind of market signals, then maybe that's a place where we can kind of shift a little bit and focus on the enabling environment. So I guess my question, and this also kind of gets to that trifecta of the science, the federal science, the kind of granting council science, private sector science. Where do you think the kind of federal government would fit best in this space? Recognizing that there's also the provincial territorial governments and its shared jurisdiction, but just trying to see, like, from what you've thought about, how do we kind of split that up?
Do you want to start?
Yeah, let me take a stab at that. Let me tell a story to get to the story. We've done a lot of work to show in Western Canada and dryland agriculture that many of the greenhouse gas goals we're approaching where we want to be. None of that's because of the environmental policy. None of it. It all predated it. In dryland agriculture, look at the data. There's 3 or 4 studies out there now. One of them's mine. There are other ones, and they're showing scope 1, scope 2. There's sinks. 3, it's a bit beyond the immediate control of the on-farm crowd. So that's where you want to get. None of that was because of federal environmental policy. It was because it made good economic sense to the producers. They adopted min-till, zero-till, and seed drills and all the other things because that's what made better profits. So moving forward to this one, you can try and guess where the technology is and throw your money at it. I don't think you're going to get very close because we're not linked up. That's a fundamental reality. I mean, as much as we might like to be, we divided our efforts. We have through SCAP, the new version. There's 10 provinces. I call it SCAT out in the West, but you know, you've taken a modest national effort, divided it by 10 provinces and up to 22 different commodity groups, and they don't talk to each other within provinces and across boundaries. So you've taken a good effort and made it small and trivial. It's iterative, it's incremental. We've got a huge Ag Canada presence in Saskatchewan. I'll give you, for instance, and NRC presence. There's no management there. The manager for our labs is in PEI or Summerland, BC. You don't do research management by being 4 time zones away. Netherlands, you're all in one town, Wageningen. That's ground zero. The third one is my own world, the Academy. We have things like the Crop Development Center that are very good at focusing in on new crop variety, but the rest of us are self-employed entrepreneurs. Academics don't take direction well. We're the perennial cats. You can throw money at us and we'll do stuff, but if it looks more interesting, we'll zig a bit and do it over here. We're not teams. We build teams through projects, through grants, but they're too short, they're too small. Australia, which took our model, the NCE model, and made it work, they've tripled to quadrupled their research in the spaces where they have long-term things. In Canada, we took the NCE model and shrunk it down to something that's irrelevant in the research space. So we've taken good stuff, models that the rest of the world is using, and shrunk them down and diminished or eliminated the ambition in them. And so it just is the reality we face. So I got distracted by the linked up. I think your number one thing you can do is help to create some standards. You're the national organization. We've got a lot of magical thinking about what is a greenhouse gas and who's capturing it and who's not. Not just in this sector, but in most sectors. And we now have the tools to actually monitor going forward, but how are we going to define baselines? How are we going to define which production practices have an influence, and how are we going to then audit sequentially and incrementally so that we can ensure that we've achieved the goals? There's none of that there. It's to a great extent, it's charlatans selling, magical elixirs. It's really weak delivery out there. It's not the scientists that are doing this. It's entrepreneurs, and they have a bit of science, but we're selling stuff that's not much different than air at this point. I think we could do a lot more. We've got the tools. We have the capacity to put together a really good sustainable environmental package.
I just want to make sure we don't undersell the work that has been going on. I mean, the department's been doing a lot of great work in terms of kind of measurement and estimation, and so I am a little
agree.
cautious to kind of
I'm not saying that the science infrastructure isn't doing it, but when I look in the commercial space, the people that are trying to monetize this, I don't see any connection. Because they come and talk to me in many cases. They're not using the science you're creating. So there's a gap there. And it's not that the scientists don't have answers and the policymakers don't have answers, it's just they're not being implemented and applied in the commercial setting.
Lenore and Tyler?
Yeah, I think builds on what you're saying, Peter. And if I were to say one thing, easy thing, targeted, right now we have 3 national funding programs in this country. CIHR for health, NSERC for science, SHRC for social science. If you're an ag, none of those fit. I've had funding from all 3. The number one thing in my mind the federal government could do is stand up a program exactly like SHRC, NSERC, CIHR for agriculture. Because every other G8 country has one, we don't, and it causes trouble. And the only proviso I'd put in there, because there is lots of funding, and that's what people always say back to me, but look at the difference in what we see come out of Guelph compared to everywhere else, because they have the OMAFRA agreement, which is basically that. And do that for the rest of the country. And my only proviso, make it so that it can have industry tightly partnered, like a MyTech. And that would supercharge. It wouldn't solve all our problems, but it would supercharge that.
Tyler?
I think a lot of it does come down to government recognizing that it needs to be an enabler and convener. So Peter talked about help to create standards. I think government often hears the last 2 words, create standards. And I think it's actually the first 2, help to, that's really, really important. And I think your example about the data work and the science work that Ag Canada does is a really good example of that, where yeah, there is good work happening, but this is, I mean, agriculture, we like silos. This is such a great example of there isn't that connection that exists. And it is unfortunate, you know, we probably haven't spent enough time talking about skills and knowledge, given how important that is to agriculture. But a labor strategy is one of the examples that was used of government trying to pioneer them. The industry already has done significant legwork on its own around a labor strategy. I think it's a bit unfortunate the government kind of comes in after the fact, after kind of work's been underway for years on the industry around industry-led solutions, and says, we're going to come up with our own, right? And I think that is a classic example in agriculture where, or maybe it's actually probably not a classic example, because I think you've seen more industry leadership on that skills and labor shortage than we have on a lot of other files. I think it's a really unique space where they've done more on their own, but then kind of government comes along a little bit later behind everyone else and says, oh, we recognize that this is an issue, we're going to do a labor strategy too. And I know that there's a lot of effort to try and make those 2 things work together, but we don't do a good enough job tearing those silos down. And the data piece is a really good example where it is unfortunate that when you look at all of the digital agriculture tools that are used today, they all define a field differently, right? How do you measure what a field tends to be different on all of these platforms. It would be really good if we could agree around what does a field mean. That doesn't mean government needs to come up with a definition of what a field is, but being a player investing in the standards development is a really good example of a role they can play.
Thank you.
Jennifer, I first wanted to start by congratulating you for organizing this event, because I think it is very important to have this discussion about agricultural sector, and it is missing now. I'm an old Aggie, and I started my service to Her Majesty's government right here. And this is one of the sectors that I think not only defines the way Canada has been seen in the past, and also in terms of innovation. We have a lot of innovation that came from the agricultural sector. And agricultural sector feeds other industries in terms of ideas and the reason for doing R&D in different related areas. I have also been to Wageningen, and I had the privilege of doing my doctorate partly with University of Guelph and partly with University of Wageningen, and I was always impressed with the way farmers in Holland were doing their farming. There was a common understanding that we are doing something for public good. And that is unfortunately something probably has been diminished, mainly because there are some industries that are now active in the farming sector. In the past, our own farmers were very much in line with the concept of agricultural sustainability, because it was their family farm, it was part of the family, they were even having names for their animals. But unfortunately now, the big corporations are considering everything as externality, so dumping it up to the society to pay for it. These are some of the observations that in terms of having more communication with the farmers, we have to recognize that. And in terms of adaptation, we have to target some of our activities towards ladies in charge of the farming. When you go to a farm in Canada, you see the guy with dirt under his nail, but the brain behind the whole operation is the lady who is sitting and working in the kitchen. They used to do all the accounting, they used to make all the policy decisions. Very active, and we had the 4-H clubs that young girls would go not only learn how to make cake, but they also listen in terms of how you share experiences in terms of management. So if we're going to do anything, we have to consider the role of women in the agri-food sector. And in terms of the innovation triangle, you basically raised what I was going to say, that in NRC, I worked at NRC too, and we called it Innovation Triangle. IRAP was there to make the connections and make sure it worked. But then we had a funding mechanism that was feeding into the process. And unfortunately, in agricultural sector, as long as I have been, I haven't seen that. My mentors, like Madame Miller, who is here, one of the pillars of the agri-food sector, I don't think I had seen anything in terms of the agri-credit. Farm Credit Corporation, yes, but in terms of funding, supporting research or innovation. I think that's a very good comment that you raised, and this is perhaps something that should be listened to. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your comment. Ernie?
Sorry, if I could just want
Yes.
to pick up on a couple of points. So we have 60 beef cows, family farm at home. They've got beef and sheep cows. Most of the people with dirt under their fingernails are women at home, and so I think that there's a bit of we need to understand that reality is different, and kind of the world is changing. And when I think of kind of the next generation around home, again, it isn't about women doing the book work. I actually think that in of, as much as you're saying we need to change how we think, I think actually you're kind of a step behind, because it's actually further, and I think that world is a lot more dynamic than people recognize. I think the other thing that is important to understand is that role of the big corporation is changing. And as much as a lot of people would see it potentially as a threat to how that traditional agriculture world looks today, if you want to think about the future of a sustainable, productive agriculture system, if you want to think about why the Dutch have the success that they do, it is because it is an integrated value chain, right? We tend not to, again, just like we talk about no-till without talking about the important role Roundup plays, we like to talk about Dutch agriculture without talking about how heavily integrated that supply chain is, and that's one of those major differences. It's not just we're a bigger country, but we don't have the integration that the Dutch do. But if you look at the investment, the skills capacity, the ability to tolerate risk that's going to be needed to produce that sustainable food in the future, it is probably a value chain that is more concentrated, that leverages large corporations more, that finds better ways to connect the work that they're doing with the work that the farmers are doing. And we need to think about that value chain differently. Again, that the red barn isn't there anymore. It is a very different world, and I think if you actually look at corporate leaders today and you think about externalities the way that you talk about it, one of the game changers in Canadian agriculture is Maple Leaf Foods effectively being one of the first carbon neutral companies in the world today. You know, I think that idea that corporations see these as kind of externalities not to worry about is different. I think we're seeing that mission-driven investment and approach that is helping to change the way we think about it. And we need more of those. Again, we have some really good examples of that in Canada that we need to embrace and celebrate.
I would just very briefly add on the diversity in the sector issue. We still have a real problem there. And it's interesting because on the university side, we've done really a lot of work to increase diversity in STEM. And it's a success story, to be honest. It's gone really well. At CDL, they did a study on venture capital in Canada in the ag tech space. 92% of venture capital in Canada in ag tech goes to white men. And that made us all very sad, but there's clearly something going horribly wrong between STEM, where the labs are very diverse, and like, oh, hey, we're giving money to these guys. And I don't have an answer there. It's something I'm very interested in digging into. But, and it's a problem with venture capital in all sectors, but this is clearly something that needs to be addressed because we are seeing really a lot of interest from a more diverse group on being in that innovation space. So how do we make that more diverse has got to be a critical issue.
So we're running short on time, so what I'm going to do is maybe get the questions and then we'll ask them all at once and then we'll answer them in a kind of rapid fire round. So go ahead.
Thank you. I started my professional career in agriculture in the Dominion Bureau of Statistics in agriculture. I remember the days of lower inventories for tomorrow, which brought a lot of trips from Western Canada to Ottawa. And one comment to start my line of thinking here, if we increase our production by 26%, can we move it? We still have to think about the rest of the value chain, if so to speak. On the other hand, in terms of how innovation is diffused within a sector, I mean, I still go back to the Iowa model of, innovators, early adopters, and then the rest of the world. But a lot of there's been a real push coming from the industry side. I mean, like a lot of the precision agriculture and so on has really been developed within the umbrella of a company. And that leads to another issue. And I'm glad that cybersecurity was mentioned. However, there's also the question of data ownership. And once you're locked in, you're locked in. And if you're going to switch from John Deere to something else, well, forget about your data. But agriculture is not unique in that regard. After leaving Stat Canada, I've been working with a group called CODATA, which is the data committee of the International Science Council. And one of the themes that keeps coming up again and again and again, and it's part of CODATA's decadal strategy for the interoperability and of data. There's a theme that is permeating the data world, research data world, I should say. And it's called FAIR. Make data findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And I think we need to start thinking at the global level and think about how this is being done, because it is happening in different sectors. It permeates into the UN's Sustainable Development Goals and all of that. So I think we need to keep that focus. So I have a lot more I could say, but I can't.
Thank you. And FAIR is actually in Peter's paper. So, Marc.
Yes, Marc Fortin from NSERC. Tyler, you've talked about the need for more R&D investment. Peter, you say something along the same lines. And typically the role of government is to de-risk investments in upstream research and development. Yet we've seen over the last few years more emphasis on adoption. One of you was talking about this. There's been significant investment on the more the D part than the R part of R&D. Right now, governments, I would say, are torn between different kinds of investments. Batteries, AI, quantum, whatever else, health. Every sector of society wants more investment in research. I'm in the world of investing in research. The typical question that I get from the Department of Finance is, what's the ROI? What is the return on investment? Because every government wants to improve the economy. What's the return on the investment? And it's interesting because on batteries or AI or quantum, the return on the investment is maybe a little fuzzier, if I can say, than a more established sector with already a $32 billion kind of revenue. So for governments to make an investment, they would need to have a sense of what the ROI is going to be. And is there a plan or a set of plans? Tyler, you mentioned that one plan can't fit, one size doesn't fit all. Who's going to make that plan? Who's going to define the ROI? Who's going to bring together academia, industry, and governments? I'm curious. Thank you.
Thank you. And then we'll have one last question, then I'll go down the line and we'll let you comment on what you'd like.
All right. Well, thank you, Jennifer, and members of the panel for the great discussion this morning. Really appreciate it. My name is Brian Trace. I'm with Bear Crop Science, but also a former grad student here. So I spent 5 years of my life working up at the NEATB building on the 4th floor, working on canola research. So it's a real treat for me to come back here today and have this discussion on policy. And I know it's a challenge. We're all trying to figure out, as Tyler said, where do we plant our flag? How do we get onto the radar screen? What are the top 3 things that we can do? And Jennifer, I think you alluded to, the work that was done by Minister Morneau and the Dominic Barton report. And, I've been in the industry for 25 years and there's been no lack of consultations. That's probably one of the best ones that I've experienced. And it wasn't just specific to agriculture, it was across all sectors. And there was this all chairs committee that provided a recommendation. And to me, it was incredible. It didn't really matter what sector you were in, if it was agriculture, transportation, oil and gas, mining. The #1 issue across all sectors was the regulatory burden here in Canada. So if anybody's looking for, a recommendation, is to maybe implement and act on that. And so, I jotted down for what it's worth some themes that have come up, because I'm thinking I participated in 5 consultations last year, probably 3 this year. Each one usually comes out with 10 to 15 recommendations. We have no lack of recommendations on where to put our stuff. But some of the themes that come up from this repeat themselves. We see it all of the time. And I think #1, I would say, and certainly today there's a theme on climate change. So yeah, you know what? Government opportunity to set some targets. And we've seen this. And I think, stakeholders will rally behind that. You need a science-based regulatory system to enable all of this innovation. I mean, we're still working on policy to enable gene editing in this country. It's been 8 years and we're still waiting. And so again, just have that enabling regulatory system. The other piece is public trust. There is no lack, as you know, of misinformation out there, not specific to agriculture, but across all sectors. And if I look at some really cool examples, what comes to mind for me is how government and media have come together to rally behind the science and the safety of vaccines and COVID. How government and media have rallied behind the science behind climate change. And if we could do the same thing to rally behind the science of innovation in agriculture, I think we'd be off to a great start. So anyway, thanks for your time today.
Thank you very much. So Tyler, I'll start with you. We had comments on data ownership and the FAIR model. Mark from MNSERC talked about the competition for different kinds of investments and return on investment. And we've heard about the regulatory burden and some very good recommendations for a way forward. So you can pick from the cornucopia of ideas there, and I'll have your last word.
Yeah, so I think you need to put it all together and again, in the context of digital agriculture, maybe in the context of everything today, talk about what is the role of government and where does public policy fit. And I think on the R&D side, there's some really interesting examples in agriculture. We are investing in wheat breeders competing with the private sector and not funding flax breeding in Canada. And I think that that's a really good example of our R&D strategy seems to want to compete with private sector investment and leave these gaps and these holes. And I think that we need to do a better, more thoughtful job about understanding where are the gaps and holes. And government needs to appreciate ROI. I'm a former political staffer. I kind of understand the pressure for that. But really, there's a public good that exists, and that should be the role of government to address that public good. And I do worry that we lose sight of that and lose sight of the fact that that's where government should be. And so I think that there's some questions around, again, digital agriculture and other things. What is that role of agriculture? Where is the public good? Data ownership is a good example of where that could be. And we need to have a more thoughtful, more clear, concise conversation around what should the role of government be in this space, and how do we focus government on that and let other parts of that triple helix play the roles that they need to play.
Thank you.
So really interesting comments. And first thing, thank you so much for bringing up the rest of the chain, because we do tend to not talk about it enough. But Canada should also be a processing superpower, because we create the raw material and we have lots of cheap green energy. So processing, definitely need to talk about it more. And it sometimes somehow falls by the wayside. The other thing I would say, why should government care? Why should this be a funding priority? Well, first of all, I never think of government as one thing. It's two things. And the bureaucratic side should focus on this because we're good at it. We have all the pieces. Canada can actually succeed in this. But politicians should care because elections are won and lost on the cost of groceries. And it is the thing I am asked to comment on in the press most right now is cost of food. And it doesn't matter how many times I say, hey, historically, food's cheap. People do not want to hear that. They want to know why butter is somehow more expensive than it used to be. And with everything going on geopolitically, the thing hurting the president of the US the most right now today is the cost of eggs. And that should make all of us remember that people care. They notice because it hits them all the time. And countries with unstable food prices have political instability. So I think it's really a no-brainer to fund the food system.
Thank you. Catherine?
I think that reference to FAIR for data is really important. My colleague is the Chief Data Officer for Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, and doing a lot of thinking around those issues and a lot of good work coming out of that team. So I guess I'll just say, really appreciate conversations like this one. I see a lot of my colleagues from Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada here. The reason I've stuck around the department for the last 18 years or so is because I've had the privilege of leading really passionate teams who are working on a lot of these issues. So yeah, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Let me make my comments in three ways. I think all governments need to think about leading, following, and knowing when to get out of the way. And I think the questions parse somewhat that way. I think public money leads, and it has a critical role in research. There is a value proposition. Ag's the only sector that actually has ROI data, and it's strong. I mean, and that tells you you're underinvesting. The average global R&D space, based on about 1,000 studies, is where I think it's an exaggeration, but they have ROIs above 50%, spread across the whole supply chain. The good thing about agriculture is that a lot of the value sticks here because they don't flee. It's a locational asset. You can't, if you've invented it for Canada, you can't move it to South Africa or China. And that's not true of most of the other investments the Canadian government's making. So we can lead. We're not putting enough in. The fact that we've got high ROIs means we're not putting enough in. Now, we also have a pathway to market, but I'm not so sure on the digital side. That's where we need to be a bit more thoughtful about how do we engage with the people who are the big players. Following, apropos of the question about data ownership and control, it's not going to be government setting the rules. It's going to be the global area and the farmers and others put together. And there's the American Farm Bureau model, which has already been talked about here, which is one, the data transparency agreements that are there. There's FAIR. Some people are pushing CARE, which is another measure. all of those are good, but we need to sort of convert good intentions into practice. And I remember working with the minister when I was in government for quite a while, who turned up at events, trade negotiations, which are a bit like standard setting negotiations. And he said, that's the most boring hour I spent in my life. It's watching paint dry. It's not exciting, it's not headline stuff, but it's vital to creating the underpinnings for the marketplace to function. So that's, but they have to be followers. They set the table, that's what the standards board does. It doesn't set the standards, it invites people in the room and creates the process so that at the end of the day we agree on what the standards will be. And Canada is unique in doing this in the agri-food space. We've got a labeling standard. It's the only one that actually fits with international law. Everybody else has invented rules out of the back pockets. And then the question is getting out of the way. And Brian's made a good point that Canada has probably, I was on a couple of regulatory review processes for Canada, and when I went around the world, I'd say to regulators who were doing what we were doing, who's good? Who do you think is a comparator to you? Canada was always mentioned in the top 3. So we're really highly respected, but we're slow. Slower than molasses in January. You know, even in November, in Saskatchewan in November. But it's not that we don't get to the right answer. And quite often we know what the answer is 1, 3, 5 years before we get there, but we just wait until others have done it, you know. Are we going to be first? There's no reason we have to do that. And in the paper I allude to the fact that Brazil and Argentina, which have barely a toehold in the research world, big area of agricultural production, and they've attracted large multinationals to come and be a target for their research efforts because they're willing to move fast. They don't reduce their standards, they don't reduce the oversight, they just say, we're not going to put you on the slow track. You got a product, you prosecute it through the regulatory regime, we'll make a decision based on the rules that are there. We could do that too. We did for a while. We were cutting edge, and then we sort of lost ambition. And so if I leave one final parting word, ambition. People in this room have exhibited passion about agriculture, and that we've got great stuff, but it doesn't add up to a whole. Whether you want to call it triple helix or impact, we've got all the right bits, but we just seem to lack the ability to sustain and focus and continue to advance our productive capacity.
That's a great way to wrap it up. Thank you for your questions. Peter, thank you. Catherine, Lenore, and Tyler. And thank you to TELUS that made this event possible and helped support the paper as well, which I hope you'll have fun reading. It's a good read. I want to note today is Giving Tuesday. If you like our work at the IRPP, you can always donate. We're a charitable organization if you haven't given all your funds for 2023. We have a new postdoctoral fellowship for Indigenous, racialized, and Black scholars, research scholars, which you can donate to. And please stick around for coffee and snacks and networking if you have the time. Thank you very much. Thank you.